With most speedruns, the game is littered with glitches and tricks that are outside the scope of normal gameplay. But Double Dragon is unique. Despite being almost 40 years old, the speedrun consists solely of exceptional gameplay. Not much was known about how the game's mechanics or code worked. The runners were just really good and executed combat flawlessly. However, over the years, they started to have questions about why certain things were happening that were seemingly inexplicable. For instance, at one point, two abobos bust out of a wall and attack you. This is a very difficult fight, as the enemies try to flank you so they can land devastating blows, with the strategy being to stack them to try and damage them at the same time. But every now and then, one of them would walk off screen and despawn, with no visible explanation as to why. Another strange occurrence had to do with weapons, as they're supposed to unload when the current screen of enemies is defeated. However, sometimes when picked up, you would get a glitched weapon that you could carry to the next screen, yet nobody knew why this was happening. Perhaps the most famous glitch was the infinite experience glitch, where a strange invisible enemy would stand still and let you pummel it, allowing players to gain experience rapidly and reach max level very fast. And finally, at the end of the game, there's a boss with a machine gun who shoots bullets, but every now and then the bullets would pass through you without causing damage, and players seemed to think it had something to do with standing at the bottom of the screen, as it wasn't understood very well. That is, until this year. Slackinator is a former world record holder in Double Dragon, and recently he didn't just discover why one of these glitches work, but all of them. And not only that, he was able to find incredible time-saving applications for them in the speedrun. And he did all of this while looking into something completely unrelated for a challenge run he was routing. In today's video, we'll go over the speedrun, the glitches players encountered but didn't understand, and how Slackinator discovered their inner workings while he wasn't even speedrunning and broke this game for the first time in nearly 40 years. To understand the early Double Dragon speedruns, we first need to understand how the game's systems work. So let's look at combat, enemy behavior, and items. Combat is very straightforward from a player's perspective. Get in range of an enemy, press attack, and do damage until you defeat it. But as you get further in the game, this gets complicated. As you defeat enemies, you gain experience, and every time you get 1000, you unlock a new move, which is represented in the game by the hearts below your health bar. At the start, you only have 3 moves: punch, kick, and headbutt. But leveling up quickly adds moves to your repertoire. 2 hearts gives you an uppercut and high kick. 3 hearts gives you the signature jump kick, with higher XP levels letting you elbow, grab, and even pummel downed opponents. But this is only half of the combat equation. As you progress and level up, enemies also level up and will start using attacks similar to yours. For example, once you unlock the jump kick, so does Williams, and it can be frustrating to deal with. But the main mechanic that drives players nuts is enemy movement. Typically, if there's one enemy on screen, they will walk towards the player and try to align themselves with you, and once they're in range, they'll begin attacking. But this behavior changes if a second enemy is on screen. While the first enemy engages the player, the second will try to flank, and this mechanic sucks to deal with. It's so bad that in most cases where there are 2 enemies on screen, the early strategy was to knock them down at the same time so you could combo them again. Which brings us to items. Most items are initially carried by enemies, and by knocking them down, they drop whatever they are carrying. So knives, baseball bats, and dynamite can all be picked up by the player. There are 2 problems with weapons, however. First, they're very slow in terms of speedrunning because they knock enemies down, which means you need to wait for them to get back up before you can damage them. And second, if you clear a screen of enemies, whatever items they brought with them will despawn. The first reason is why the weapon glitch mentioned earlier was never explored. Using items is just too slow for the speedrun. But in 2021, Slackinator was looking at ways to improve the speedrun, and he stumbled into something that laid the foundation for this game to be turned on its head. Slack set a world record of 11 minutes and 6 seconds in 2020, and while the run was good, it didn't have any insane glitches and was mostly very well executed gameplay. But there was one glitch he wanted to make more consistent: the abobo despawn. Previously, players reported that one of the abobos would walk off screen and despawn on rare occasions, but this phenomena wasn't well documented or understood. So, Slack did what any speedrunner would do in this situation: spend spend an enormous amount of time brute forcing different actions in the fight until the behavior is replicated. The first thing he noticed from the few clips that existed of the despawn was that the Abobo was walking backwards when it went off screen, and he realized that the only time an enemy does this is when it's trying to flank. So, he took a look at the code to get a better understanding of this behavior. He learned that when an enemy is flanking, the code is giving it instructions to get to the opposite side of the player. He then realized that during this process, the enemy walks backwards after it crosses over the player's x-axis. Once he understood this, he started trying random to try and see if there was some action the player performed that caused the flanking enemy to moonwalk off screen, and eventually he replicated the behavior. Upon further investigation, what he found was that if while the flanking enemy is backing up, you jump over the attacking enemy, the flanker would continue walking backwards until it reached a despawn trigger off screen and unloads itself. He didn't dig too deep into the code once he discovered this, but the act of jumping over the attacking enemy causes the movement routine of the flanker to never update. And with this knowledge, Slack learned something. It wasn't just the Abobos that could be despawned, it was any pair of enemies. So, he started looking for spots in the run where you could Thanos enemies to save time. However, this glitch presented an interesting problem. If you despawn enemies, you'll miss XP and won't unlock moves. This has a dramatic effect on the XP route, since if you despawn everything and delay learning moves, you won't be able to effectively defeat stronger enemies, with the final level being particularly difficult if you're under-leveled. So, the route evolved to only despawn certain enemies while still learning moves in a way that optimized for the final level. At this point, you're probably thinking that Slack took this discovery and set a new world record, which is normally the case when someone discovers a breakthrough like this, except Slack had a major problem. Bughoney. Bughoney is so good at the game that his PB was a full minute ahead of Slack's, and that was by pure gameplay mechanics alone. And while Slack's despawn glitch saved time, it didn't make up a full minute. So rather than spend over a year getting as good as Bughoney, he left the inclusion of this glitch to better runners. However, he wasn't done with the game. Wanting to breathe new life into classic games he enjoyed playing, Slack started something he called the Flawless NES Project, where his goal is to beat more NES games without taking damage than any other person. And it's in this challenge that he returned to Double Dragon later in 2021. Due to the enemy behavior, getting a no-hit run in Double Dragon is difficult enough on its own. But Slack wanted an even greater challenge, so he decided he'd only use the headbutt attack in a run he called the Forehead of Justice. The first thing he realized was that leveling up was going to be an issue since he didn't want the enemies learning new moves. So, he started applying the despawn glitch wherever he could. And while routing out this run, he also figured out how two of the mystery glitches work: the ghost enemy and the phantom machine gunner bullets. Due to the technical limitations of the NES, there can only be two enemies on screen at the same time. So when an enemy dies, the game unloads it and replaces it with a new enemy if there is another that needs to be loaded on that screen. However, if an enemy despawns instead of dying and there isn't another enemy to spawn, something bizarre happens. Instead of deleting the enemy and carrying on, the game only unloads the sprite and code that controls it, but leaves the hitbox loaded in, which means you can pummel it forever and gain infinite XP. So when players encountered this glitch previously, they were inadvertently triggering the despawn glitch on the final two enemies of a screen. And with that mystery solved, Slack had another to unravel: the non-damaging bullets from the machine gunner. Typically, the machine gunner fires shots at you that cause big damage, but every so often, runners would get a fight where the bullets passed through them inexplicably. And oddly, if these bullets ricocheted off a wall after passing through you, they would then damage you, which baffled players. The belief among runners was that this was just a random glitch, but as Slack learned more about the game, he started to get an idea of what was happening. Let's rewind 3 enemy groups. The second group of enemies that spawn are called Chins, and one of them comes armed with a knife, and as Slack soon found out, knives have some very weird properties. For instance, if an enemy throws a knife, it can hit the player, but they're immune to any knife they throw, with the same being true for the player. Any knife you throw, you're immune to, but it can damage an enemy. There's also a strange edge case that Slack noticed. If you throw a knife and it hits a wall, the flag in memory becomes flipped, meaning that the knife you just threw can now damage you. And once Slack deduced all of this, he figured out why the machine gunner bullets sometimes didn't hurt the player. It turns out that the act of picking up a knife applies its properties to all projectiles, meaning once you have it in hand, it's not just that knife that you're immune to, it's all projectiles. So the machine gunner glitch was being caused by players picking up a knife 3 fights earlier. All of this new knowledge helped give Slack a better understanding of the game and how despawning enemies works, which he used to make huge progress at improving the run.
I'm slower. I'm slower. Go! Yes! It's faster than the task!
This new discovery was very valuable to the headbutt run for one big reason. Killing enemies takes time, and the hardest enemy you have to deal with is the level timer. While the level timer is inconsequential for the speedrun, it's an impassable barrier for the Forehead of Justice run. Because it takes so long to kill the final boss with headbutts, you actually run out of time before you can kill him. But Slack had an idea. What if instead of defeating Jimmy, we despawn him? This is easier said than done, however, as Jimmy is missing one key piece for the despawn glitch, a second enemy. So, there's no flanking mechanic to exploit. But Slack noticed that sometimes when you jumped, Jimmy would back up. Digging deeper into this, he discovered that Jimmy backed up whenever you faced away and jumped. So he had an idea. What if you could get Jimmy to back up far enough that he walked off screen and despawned? Wanting to understand why Jimmy was backing up with this specific jump, he looked in the game's RAM but couldn't make sense of what was going on and figured it might be based on RNG. But there was something else about this behavior that puzzled him. The distance that Jimmy walked backwards would vary. The most peculiar thing he discovered was that if you fall into the spike pit, Jimmy would continue doing whatever action he was carrying out when you fell. And if he was walking backwards when you died, he'd walk all the way to the edge of the screen. And sometimes he'd even go to a spot that should have despawned him, except he didn't despawn. Slack exhausted every possible option he could think of trying to decipher this, except for one, picking up an item. This should have been impossible, as there are no items in the Jimmy fight. However, there is a knife in an earlier fight, so Slack glitched the knife from fight to fight to bring it into the Jimmy battle. He was able to do this because he figured out what causes the glitched item. By picking up a weapon during the final frames before it despawns, the game still tries to despawn it. Except now, you're holding it, so a glitched mess ends up getting created that has the properties of an item. When Slack picked the glitch item up in the Jimmy fight, he started walking backwards, but it came just short of getting him to the despawn trigger by 2 pixels.
Oh, this is even... lucky, this is even worse. It's even worse because now I'm not 20 frames away, I'm 2 pixels away. It's even worse.
Once again, he dug into the code and realized that the function controlling the enemy movement didn't update when the player performed certain actions. So while executing a facing away jump, crouching, or picking up items, the enemy movement code would keep repeating whatever its last instruction was. With this knowledge, he began brainstorming ideas on stream for how to get Jimmy to move the final 2 pixels when a viewer asked him why he was trying this on the right side. So, to humor the viewer, he went to the left side and realized something.
If I jump up in the air and turn around in the air, see I'm 24? I should be able to, there's 22. There's our 2 pixels right there.
When you're at the bottom and holding the walk button to the left, Billy's X position is 22, except you're facing away from Jimmy. Slack assumed that this X position is the same on both sides, which it is. However, the act of moving to the other side revealed something to him.
What if the enemy, while we're facing this way, knocks us backwards?
Previously, he had been exploring this at 2 positions, facing away from Jimmy, as that was the closest X position you could get to the despawn, and by facing Jimmy, which has your X position at 26. And it was in this latter position that he came just 2 pixels short of getting Jimmy to despawn. His new idea was to get into X position 26, then bait Jimmy into jump kicking through him, as this would achieve 2 things, getting Jimmy on your left side, and the knockback would get your character 2 more pixels to the left. Once you were knocked back, Jimmy would try to square up with you. Then to delay his backup animation, Slack would jump, then pick up the glitched item when the crouch animation was ending. And when he tested this theory...
Yes! Ah, it's possible! It's possible! You can do it! You can! It is possible to despawn this freaking jerk.
At long last, Slack had convinced Bimmy to Thanos himself, and had the chatter not asked him if both sides were the same, he may never have discovered this. As it stands currently, this hasn't been used in a speedrun, but Slack is actively doing speedrun attempts. So go check him out at the links pinned below and let him know that I sent you with the raid message AbyssoftZ.